Okay, this is number 15 on page 547. So this refers to exercise 13. Well, exercise 13 was saying that the null hypothesis is that all students like school about the same. The average would be 115. See, they take a test that scores from 0 to 200. The alternative hypothesis is that the older students like school better than that. So they take a sample, and they get an average for that sample was 127.5. That was their average. So that yields a p-value, which we haven't really figured out how to get yet, but we will later, of 0.01. What does that mean? Well, what it means is, let's just say that it's true that the average student, regardless of age, likes school about 115. That would be the average for all students, including the older students. Well, if that's true, and we happen to get a group of older students that just happen to like school a lot, how often would that happen? Well, if this was true, getting a score that high, we only have a 1% chance of that happening. That's what the p-value means. If we look at the graph, like a normal curve like this, assuming that that's 115, right? We have a really high score of 127.5. What's the chance of getting a score that high or higher? Only 1%. So we either got really, really lucky by picking a bunch of older students that really like school, or maybe this isn't true. Maybe it's true that older students do like school better. That's what the p-value means. Okay, number 19. Now check this out. If there's a life-threatening injury, as they say, a life-threatening injury, people need assistance within the first 8 minutes. Now in this one city, the emergency personnel, the average time was 6.7 minutes. Now they're there within 6.7 minutes, about 78% of the calls. Now the city manager wants them to do better than that. Okay, so what are we looking at? What is our parameter? Well, we are looking at mu. That's the average time for, it's the average response time. Okay, the average response time. And so we would say that the null hypothesis is after that year, when the city manager said do better, that there was no change. That's the nickname for the null hypothesis. So we're going to say that after that, they really didn't improve. They stayed exactly the same, no change. Or, since we want to say did they do better, we're going to say the alternative hypothesis is that that average time was less. Okay, that's the answer to letter A. Now let's think about the type 1 and type 2 error. So I'm going to draw a picture. Whoops. Here we go. Draw a picture like this. Okay, just something like this. Now, so let's just say we get a p-value and we have a sample and the average is much less than 6.7. And we are underneath our alpha level, which means we would reject the null hypothesis. Which type of error is that? Well, rejecting the null hypothesis, when the null hypothesis is true, that's a type 1. What would that mean? It means if we reject the null hypothesis, it's saying we are thinking that our times are actually going down, we're doing better, which would mean that they would take the pressure off the emergency personnel even though they're not getting better. So we stop trying to improve. That would be the consequence. So firemen and ambulance drivers and police are high-fiving each other and people are dying all over the place. So what about a type 2? Let's take a look at that. So type 2 is when we get a value that's in here, which says, well, the value that we got for our sample would happen, whatever, say 20% of the time. So we would fail to reject the null hypothesis and continue to try to get better. Well, here's the mistake for a type 2 is that we did this by mistake. Okay, we got a weird sample. So now we're saying we keep trying to improve, even though they did it. They did improve. So what's the consequence in that one? Well, they keep putting pressure on the firemen and the police and the ambulance drivers to get better and better, even though they have gotten better. Well, that adds more stress to an already stressful job, and maybe you get a lot of people that just retire or quit because they're like, I can't take this anymore. I can't do any better than you're asking me to do. Something like that, right? Okay. Type 1 and type 2 mistakes. Now, in lots of different cases, you're going to say, well, which one is more serious? A type 1 or a type 2? Well, a lot of times it really depends on the situation. I would think that the more serious mistake would be the type 1, meaning we stop trying to improve. We think that we've met our goals and we really haven't. And that puts a lot of people at risk, and we have no idea that we actually are not getting better. Okay, there you go.